It really comes down to we need energy, right? And where's it coming from? GDP is so tightly correlated with energy usage. Even if you look at it from that kind of abstract perspective, it's understood that we need to be producing more power, more and more constantly, right? So, and then one of the nice things about renewables is the relatively quick construction timeline, right? You can get those megawatts onto the grid and serve those energy needs in a really rapid way.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy, your host, the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm excited to have Dorian Hunt from Leo Berwick. He's the partner head of renewable energy there, M&A tax advisory for renewables infrastructure and private equity. We're actually going to be talking about the new safe harboring rules that was issued actually last Friday. And this interview is actually being recorded on August 22nd, 2025. I'm providing the dates just because everything seems to be changing pretty rapidly with obviously the passage of the big, beautiful bill. Dorian, welcome to the podcast. I really appreciate you making time.
Thanks, Benoy. I'm really happy to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, definitely. And I appreciate you providing guidance to our audience, who we call Mavericks, about what you're seeing in the renewables industries. Obviously, we're going to talk about safe harboring new rules, the big, beautiful bill. Also, we're still waiting for the fiat guidance. But I think it would be helpful if you could start off maybe talking about Leo Berwick and also your background in renewables.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, Leo Berwick, we're a transaction advisory firm that's focused on energy and infrastructure. So, we are really a carefully curated team of professionals that are experts in tax or financial advisory, valuation, cost segregation, that focus on transactions in the energy and infrastructure space. And we really pride ourselves on getting deals done and getting across the finish line. So, we try to stick to our sector focus because that helps us apply all of our, for example, tax technical disciplines in a way that is sensitive to the market and commercial and realistic.
Yeah, that's a great summary of what Leo Berwick does. And it's actually a small world because two people that I worked with, Michael Mull and Rick Ellsworth, when I first graduated from grad school at Deloitte, the energy practice, are at Leo Berwick. And it's a small world. They also work with Dorian. So I've learned a lot about the organization, and they're great to work with. And they have many years of experience working on the advisory side for energy and renewables. So
For sure. And as it relates to valuation and appraisal, they're absolute luminaries, well known in the industry and also with endless technical depth. So, yeah, we're happy to have them here rowing in the same direction. And personally, as you mentioned, Benoy, I'm the head of renewables energy here at Leo Berwick. And so I really touch most of our functions here, whether that's in transaction advisory, M&A, or doing advisory for developers and independent power producers, or acting as tax insurance underwriting counsel. My technical expertise kind of touches all of those different workflows in different ways. And a little bit about my background. So I've been working in renewables for about 20 years. So prior to my role here, I was at a Big Four where I was doing tax equity finance in one form or another. It existed ever since it was a thing. And prior to that, I was a software engineer, mainly focused in embedded systems and defense. So it's been a really fun journey through those various experiences to get here.
yeah, that's amazing to hear about your experience. I didn't realize that you started out as a software engineer, and obviously you've been in renewables for a very long time. The original, we should be calling you the Maverick.
One day I hope to be a maverick.
You already are. And I would tell you too, I really enjoy the content that you're putting out on LinkedIn, the videos discussing, the major things that are happening in renewables. So definitely we'll have obviously your LinkedIn on the podcast notes, because I think you're really providing, great content and up-to-date content too, right? Because everything's changing so quickly in the renewable space in the US. So I appreciate your thought leadership on that.
Yeah, and I really try to move quickly and be agile, right? And be responsive to what I think everyone's going to be worried about and asking questions about, and really getting ahead of that. So, I really pride myself on being a guide through the journey. And I think that my experience through all the ups and downs, over the past 20 years maybe gives me a little bit of a different lens, a little bit of a different perspective on what the current state of things is and what that means and how we move forward.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. And, I appreciate you making time out of your schedule to talk about the safe harboring
Sure.
provisions. And can you go into detail? Obviously, I think Treasury provided guidance last Friday, August 15th.
Hmm.
Hopefully, we'll have this podcast, which is being, as I said, recorded on August 22nd. We'll be releasing it in a few days. Can you talk about the guidance? I know everyone was, I guess, thinking it was gonna be a lot worse
Hmm.
than it actually was, just because obviously of what happened with the big beautiful bill and expectations. And
Of
can you
course.
talk about that and also feedback too? I'm sure you're hearing from a lot of your clients and customers from, various questions they have. I'm curious to
Yeah.
get their perspective on it too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the guidance, whatever we get a new piece of guidance like we did last Friday on the 15th, good or bad, I always appreciate the clarity, right? Because the most difficult thing, in my view, is to operate without sufficient guidance. And I think that is the case with many industry participants because since the passage of the one big beautiful bill and a few days later the issuance of the executive order kind of telegraphing the arrival of this new start of construction guidance, I did see those things have a little bit of a chilling effect on activity among a lot of industry participants, just not knowing how to move forward and what to do next, not knowing what that guidance was going to look like. So we got the guidance on the 15th, and the bottom line is, well, the big picture, the headline, I should say, is that start of construction is going to be generally going forward be premised on physical work of a significant nature as opposed to the 5% safe harbor. So, sometimes those terms are conflated and people use the phrase safe harbor to describe start of construction, but really it's start of construction and there's two paths to take, or there have been historically, the 5% safe harbor or physical work of a significant nature. 5% safe harbor is a more quantitative analysis and has to do with costs you've incurred, equipment you've acquired, that sort of thing. And physical work of a significant nature is qualitative in a lot of ways. And that has to do with, okay, have you done significant physical work for stuff that's going to be considered energy property going forward? So we've had this framework of the 5% safe harbor and physical work since the 1603 grant days when we first saw this introduced and applied to renewable energy assets. And there's been evolutions over the years since then, or whether a certain developer was going to choose the 5% safe harbor or physical work of a significant nature was largely optional, depending on what you had more comfort with in a particular circumstance. So the new notice 2025-42 says that going forward for wind and solar, physical work is going to be the only game in town. So that's going to be starting on September 2nd is when those guidelines are going to kick in. So if you had to start a construction prior to that using, 5% or physical work, I think for most purposes, you can consider that a good start. But September 2nd and going forward, physical work is going to be the rule unless you are a solar facility that has an AC nameplate capacity of less than 1.5 megawatts. So we still have going forward the opportunity to use the 5% safe harbor for those low output solar deals, as we call them. And I think that all things considered, that provision is sensitive to at least one aspect of industry dynamics, which is that, sometimes when you're doing those smaller output deals, maybe they're rooftop deals, right, where you don't have that site access on which you can do physical work and demonstrate a start construction that way. So, perhaps the only path forward is to do that 5% safe harbor. So I'm happy to see at least that exception for small output solar deals was put in place as part of the notice.
Yeah, and I appreciate you explaining. I think there's been, with the whole safe harboring, people assume that that's the start of construction. So obviously, now it is a true start of construction for projects over, when it's solar over 1.5 AC. And usually, just like who our audience are, if they're not familiar, is usually the 5% that's spent on the project. Is it primarily used for module sales?
So really, it's pretty much anything that's going to be part of the energy property that you acquire used for the 5% test. So in the context of solar, that's usually modules, inverters, trackers, the normal stuff that you would put into place in one of these systems. Now, there are some, maybe other strategies. And of course, we have different outcomes and fact patterns if we have different asset classes. But yeah, it really comes down to the 5% safe harbor, acquiring that equipment, accruing those costs, capitalizing those costs, and making sure that those costs are at least 5% of what the basis of the asset is at the time that it is eventually placed into service. So even with the perceived quantitative certainty tied to the 5% safe harbor, you still don't really know if you met the threshold until such time as you take a full reckoning of the asset basis at the time it's placed in service. So, things like cost overruns or fair market value step up in the case of tax equity partnerships or pref equity structures or something like that, could cause you to think you had a good start of construction using the 5% safe harbor, but then you didn't. So, I think that the physical work of a significant nature has been less favored among some types of investors historically. And I think that's a bit due to the perceived lack of that quantitative certainty. But I think going forward, it's going to have to be the case. The industry is going to have to come to a consensus on what sets of facts and circumstances are going to be financeable, right, and defensible and solid enough to back.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate you explaining that. And I think, too, starting it off with, I think the industry wants certainty, right? So it's great, obviously, that the safe harbor guidance came out. The reason why safe harboring is important is to qualify for the investment tax credit that is 30%. So,
Sure.
like, probably, if we have like people who are relatively new to the industry, that's why the safe harboring is so important.
For sure. And that's a great point, Benoy. I just dove right into the specifics of this notice. And some viewers might wonder, okay, why do I care when I start a construction as long as the project is eventually in service, right? What is this, a piece of trivia? No, it's more than that. The start of construction concept has been used, for many, many years to establish certain aspects of a project that are in part determine the level of incentive that might be available. So, a couple of years ago, it was if you started construction prior to January 29th, 2023, your project, even if it were over 1 megawatt in nameplate, you would be exempt from having to fulfill the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements that are attendant to the determination of credits. And it's used, for example, in the so-called special rule for the energy community adder, right? And now, of course,
That's
with the
true.
passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, we see that start of construction for wind and solar in particular is particularly important when you think about what level of credit might be available. So maybe if I could just give a quick rundown
Sure.
of the taxonomy there. So if a project starts construction prior to the end of this calendar year, then it's going to have 4 years to be placed in service, and it's not going to be subject to the foreign entity of concern material assistance limitations, they call them. And we talk a little bit about that later in more detail. But then again, if a project were to start construction starting between January 1, 26 and July 5th, 26, then that project would still have 4 years to be placed into service, but it would be subject to those foreign entity of concern material assistance limitations. Any project that starts construction after July 4th date in 2026, it is going to be subject to the material assistance limitations, and it's going to have to be in service before the end of 2027. So just that alone, even if we put aside the other things I mentioned about start of construction and it's important, I mean, that alone, I think that schedule I described is driving a lot of behaviors and activity and tactical planning about how to move forward.
Yeah, definitely. That's actually a great summary of really how the ITC is impacted by the big beautiful bill. And then too, why you're seeing obviously a lot of activity because people want to obviously maximize the incentive with the least amount of limitations, right?
For
I
sure,
think.
for sure. But now I do want to caveat one thing. An interesting bit of notice 2025-42 may have been missed by some readers. There's a footnote in there that says the start of construction guidance provided is not to be used for the purposes of these foreign entity of concern limitations. So
Oh, interesting.
that, among other things, kind of telegraphs the imminent arrival of additional startup construction guidance that is going to be specific to this foreign entity of concern limitation. So the story's not done yet. Well, it's never done, right? Or it's
Yeah,
always an evolving situation. But
it's
this
a simple
particular episode, let's say, of the story or this chapter is not yet complete, in my view, until we get that full picture around the foreign entity of concern limitation startup construction guidance.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great transition. And if people are not familiar, really, the foreign entity of concern really applies to China. A lot of the materials and is coming from China,
Mhm.
solar. I think a lot of the assembly now we're actually doing in the US. But when you talk about batteries, obviously, like this year, that's not an issue, but it starts next year, which is not that far away. It's crazy. We're almost into September. I've heard there's been a lot of like discussions about FIAC. we don't actually know when this guidance is going to be provided. Can you provide like any clarity of like what's happening? I hear like there's a lot of discussions and back and forth, but I don't know like clearly what's happening.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I have a much additional clarity, but maybe I can point out that the executive order that came out on July 7th that kind of foretold the arrival of this guidance that we got on the 15th also mentioned that foreign entity of concern guidance might be coming within that same 45-day window. Now, that has passed and, we haven't seen that guidance come across yet. I think most everybody except maybe any who's really deep inside the catacombs, wherever they're drafting these things, really has additional insight as to when that guidance is going to be coming out. But I do want to point out that there's a start of construction guidance as it relates to the foreign entity of concern limitations, which is what we're talking about right now. But then, there's additional forthcoming guidance that's mentioned in the statute of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act around foreign entity of concern limitations more broadly, such as the implementation of the material assistance limitations and the publication of tables that are going to be applied to certain technologies, right? So I think that guidance is further out. And for the time being, as it relates to material assistance limitations, taxpayers can rely on the domestic content guidance that came with what they call the new updated elective safe harbor, I think they called it, for domestic content adders, and kind of use that to say, okay, if we meet the required thresholds, which are ratcheting up as it relates to foreign entity of concern material limitations by making reference to that domestic content guidance, then we're not going to be subject to the excision of credits from that particular deal. There's a few moving pieces. And also, that doesn't even get into the other aspect of foreign entity of concern limitations related to ownership and influence,
Oh, yes, that's a great point.
which is a whole nother can of worms to unpack.
Yeah, and basically that's essentially you can have a certain percentage of ownership by one of these countries from a foreign entity of concern, which I think they're
Yeah.
specifically focusing on China on that.
There's specified entities as well. We have lists of entities
Yeah.
themselves that are in that bucket. And of course, the countries. So I think that analysis and how you conduct that, it may be straightforward or it may be pretty complicated depending on what your ownership structure is and understanding, what's all the way up the chain and how do you quantify that? How do you define what influence is and control, getting your hands around all the contracts that might be in place for a particular deal and understanding how that affects that foreign entity of concern kind of ownership and influence limitation.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I appreciate you explaining, Dorian. And obviously, you've been talking about the big, beautiful bill that was signed by President Trump on July 4th. Can you talk about like it's only been maybe 6 or 7 weeks since the bill's been passed? Like, and obviously you're talking to a lot of your clients. A
Mm.
lot of people are rushing now, obviously, to build projects. There's also too people trying to figure out the situation or even totally leaving the market and kind of waiting. I guess what can you talk about regarding the big beautiful bill? And then also too, like what you've been hearing. I'm sure you've been having many discussions and it's been really busy
Sure.
time.
Sure. Yeah. So I think with the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill, the reactions I saw for the most part were, denial, bargaining, anger, depression. And I think we're in acceptance now. So I think we went through the stages of grief as an industry around how to interpret this guidance and how to react to it, I think maybe is the better word to use. So I'm seeing most of my contacts, my clients are now trying to think tactically about how to maneuver in this new environment. And a lot of that has to do now with really getting a crisp understanding of start of construction, and particularly since the issuance of the guidance, on the 15th, what does physical work really mean? What are the boundaries of that? And how can we confidently move forward along efforts that are in pursuit of that physical work determination? So seeing suddenly a real increased appetite to get a feel for what that is. So if you're a solar developer, I think that's what I'm seeing for the most part. Just, okay, how can I make sure I get as many of my deals protected from these onerous limitations as I can, as the various milestones that I alluded to previously are elapsing. If you're have a different perspective, an energy off-taker, for example, I think a lot of it has to do with, understanding where solar fits in, but also, okay, I need power to do stuff. And maybe a lot of that power is behind the meter. Where am I going to get it? Right. And thinking about, okay, is it fuel cell? Is it a collection of batteries? Is it, CHP system? What is it I'm going to have installed to meet my energy demands? Right. And, what does my overall composition across my portfolio look like, given how some technologies were treated, less favorably than others under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. Like, I think like the audience should know that all energy assets have basically federal incentives related to it. And it's not just renewables, it's fossil fuels.
Sure. And
But
has been forever. I mean, had their share of federal incentives since time immemorial, right? And it really just comes down to these incentives are a way Congress to pull levers to incentivize, certain behaviors, right? And energy is such a crucial part of everything we do, right? So to pull those levers as they relate to energy is something that I think, must be done. So we're all going in a consistent direction and also has been done ever since before I can remember.
yeah, definitely. That's a great point. And then too, like other parts, the provisions of the bill, as you kind of mentioned, like they extend the ITC for 30% for storage, I think till 2033. There's geothermal fuel cells. They kept
Yeah.
transferability. They kept as well the Section 45, which is basically for American made production, and then also energy communities, which you mentioned a little bit about.
Yeah.
There are some obviously good things. I think like things in the future are gonna be storage only or and solar
Sure.
plus storage. I think the hard part with the OBB was the how dramatic the step down of the ITC was,
Sure.
and then
Sure.
all the rules related to safe harboring and the FIAC make it
Absolutely.
so much more complicated.
It does make it a lot more complicated. But yeah, there were some interesting tidbits that I did not expect in the bill. And you mentioned geothermal, right? So there was some clarity provided around geothermal assets that make it easier to implement common structures with less tax risk around the application of what they call the limited use rules to leasing arrangements as it relates to geothermal heat pumps. I think it was a win for geothermal. And fuel cells, right? With the passage of the IRA, fuel cells were treated as what they call combustion and gasification technology for sections 48 cap E and 45 cap Y, which, prior to the bill, the one beautiful bill, those fuel cell assets would have had to been able to demonstrate or perform a life cycle greenhouse gas analysis, given they had that designation as combustion and gasification in order to be eligible for credits. And the bill brought fuel cells back into the mix and effectively made them whitelisted, which again was a surprise to me. So there was some preferential treatment and, less preferential treatment for others. Probably wind, I think, in my view, got hit pretty hard because not only did we get the similar phase outs and FIAC restrictions that we got for solar, but then we got the accelerated truncation of the 45 capex advanced energy manufacturing tax credits for wind energy components.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that as well. It obviously seems like the administration is, obviously anti-wind. They've clearly communicated that. And even when you read the executive order from
Mhm.
July 7th, it's very negative towards the wind and solar industry. The first,
Yeah, yeah. A lot of vitriolic language in there toward, an asset class, which is confusing to me, but here we are. And it's not just the tax levers that are being pulled, right? I think that this administration is doing what it can in other ways to make it difficult for projects to get developed. So, USDA, no longer giving loans to farmers for
oh yes,
projects,
that
right?
happened
And yeah,
recently.
yeah, right.
Solar for all as
Yeah,
well.
solar for all getting cut and just permitting, becoming more difficult in cases where they can intervene and make permitting more difficult, right? So multi-pronged kind of attack across on certain asset classes that produce energy.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that. Very helpful to understand. And then, is there anything else that we haven't covered with the big beautiful bill, safe harboring, FIAC?
I'm
Really,
sure there's a million things we haven't talked about, but I think we have limited time,
future.
so maybe we can have another 10 episodes where we talk.
Yeah, for sure. A few hours.
Yeah. I like this idea. I think, in my view, that touches on big important points of what we've learned. And you said 6 weeks, and since the one beautiful bill, I can't believe it's only been that long. It feels like a little bit of a lifetime.
Oh
But
my gosh,
yeah,
that's a great point, by the way, too. Like, it seems forever. First, like when it first we're talking about it, and then I think that was in beginning of May, and then to obviously it being passed July 4th. Then everyone's been waiting 45 days for the guidance. We got the guidance for safe harboring, but we have no idea about FIAC. So it's really hard to plan for next year.
yeah,
That's a
yeah,
great point. I appreciate you talking about that.
of course.
And then too, like I've been hearing so much and seeing actually a lot of like renewable repowering projects. You've actually created a lot of content regarding like economic obsolescence and renewables repowering. Can you first talk about like what renewables repowering is and then
Yeah,
the
yeah.
importance of economic obsolescence?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, a repower in the renewables context is when you do enough work basically on an old project that's been in operation. You do enough work on it so that it is deemed effectively to be a new asset placed in service at the time that work is completed. So it's kind of, like have you replaced enough stuff on it such that it's going to be considered a new piece of equipment. So it's like a ship of Theseus paradox or like a grandfather's axe parable, right? Put in, codified into the guidance. As it relates to renewables, I think we go back probably to Revenue Ruling 9431, which talks about the idea of a repower in the wind energy space. So I think that even despite its age, that piece of guidance still is relied upon quite a bit for navigating how to think about repowers. Now we're not completely, left to our own devices when it comes to thinking about how we might demonstrate we've done enough work on an asset that it's effectively new and repowered. But instead, we have what's called the 80/20 test. And if you pass the 80/20 test, as they call it, and I'll describe the math in a minute, if you pass the 80/20 test, then you're going to be deemed to have a new asset. And when you have a new asset, if it's, let's say, a wind asset or a solar asset, maybe you're eligible for an additional slug of investment tax credits or production tax credits, depending on the context. So in order to do the calculation, basically, roughly, it's like this. You want to calculate a ratio, the numerator of which is your new capitalized expenditures that you're putting into your project. So the numerator is the new capitalized expenditures, and the denominator is the sum of that same numerator, so capitalized expenditures, and the tricky piece here where economic obsolescence comes into play is the value of the retained components, right? So the tricky part, or one of the tricky parts, is assigning a value to those pieces of equipment that are going to remain in use after all the capex is spent and the work performed in order to conduct the repower. So when it comes down to those new costs, that's relatively more straightforward. It's okay. I bought a wind turbine, it costs this much, or I bought a bunch of solar panels, it costs this much. Therefore, I know my numerator and I know part of my denominator, right, to a large degree. But the part that is a little bit trickier to navigate is that retained component piece. Now, the way to go about assessing that value of the retained component, typically we go through the valuation process of starting with replacement cost new. Okay, what would it take to like build this thing new, right? And then carving out, then going through a few steps as indicated by the use paper, the valuation kind of appraisal standards are recognized and applied in the US. So you first consider physical depreciation. If I think about the asset, let's say on a straight line basis, and it's a 30-year asset, 10 years of it have elapsed, maybe you apply a 33.333% reduction in the value based on that physical depreciation. Then you go into the next kind of limiting factor or reduction factor, which is a functional obsolescence, which is to say, this stuff I have installed right now that's operating right now, it's not quite as good, right, as in terms of, its ability to produce the energy, something I might get on the market today. So I'll make an adjustment for that. Then finally, there's what you would allude to, Benoy, is the economic obsolescence factor, which is stuff that's not necessarily project specific, more things that are outside of the project's control. Usually, the conversation is about, okay, energy prices. What can I expect to
Okay.
sell this electricity for, just given market dynamics otherwise, apart from whatever contracts I have in place? But also, as the landscape evolves, I think that you might also consider things like tariffs, right, that are outside of project control and maybe weren't considered in the initial pro forma estimates of how the project might operate and how maintenance might be performed. Things like tariffs, do they jack up the price of components I need to procure to do my own and things like that? So when you think about economic obsolescence, you need to think about those macro factors, if you will, that are a little bit outside the envelope of your particular project. But you should be going through all three of those steps when you're trying to figure out what that retained component value is, right? And there's an engineering aspect to it too. Okay, you get this value, how do you assign it to the various pieces and whatnot? But that's effectively the way it works. Now, repowers can be sensitive to changes in that retained component value, whether that's driven by the functional or economic obsolescence piece of it. And because there's a little bit of subjectivity and judgment that's buried in those determinations, that can maybe make an attack surface for somebody who wants to take a contrary position, right? And say, no, your retained components are worth a lot more than you said. Therefore, you didn't meet that 80% ratio, right? So when you're doing one of these repowers, I think it's really important to do it in phases so you gradually understand whether what you're doing is really going to be creative and additive to your overall tax credit profile.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate you explaining that, especially as repowering is becoming really popular. I'm seeing a lot of solar repowering in a
Mhm.
lot of different states. So obviously,
And why not? I mean, especially since, now with interconnection queues all jammed up and it's harder to get permitting at sites and that sort of thing, it
yes.
makes all the sense in the world to take advantage of whatever and reuse whatever you can on a particular site and effectively turn it into a new productive asset. So, what does that mean in the solar context? Does that mean ripping out all your modules that are a bit aged and your inverters that are burnt out and you just keep your racking and can that and does the math check out? Maybe, but it really depends on okay, how much was that racking worth? If it was made of gold, then it might be difficult. Well, doing that math. So ever since the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of the reintroduction of production tax credits for solar, I've been really curious to see how those repowers would play out. And I'm happy we're starting to see a lot more of those because historically, as it relates to renewables, so much of this 80/20 and repower activity has been for wind. It's fun to work through the problems that are just attendant to the different asset classes that might be credit eligible.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, that's a great point too. So are you seeing with the repowering with solar, people are basically obviously using the PTC?
Well, not necessarily, right? So actually, that's interesting you say that because when the Inflation Reduction Act came out, there was diversity in practice across the industry, but a lot of stakeholders took the view that the 80/20 was not applicable to investment tax credits, right? That if you had spend, it was on equipment that was energy property, then you get incremental ITCs for that. But now in 2023, when the Section 48 regulations came out, they introduced, or kind of clarified this concept that it's Treasury's view that the 80/20 does apply for ITCs, right? So when the IRA came out, from the window between the IRA coming out and the issuance of the Section 48 regulations, I was thinking repowers all have to do with PTCs, right?
Yes.
Which is why I was thinking about PTCs in the context of solar. But as we now know, Treasury's view is that the 80/20 just does have that more broad application.
Yeah, that is interesting. I appreciate you explaining that.
Of course.
And then, going back to a point that I've wanted to talk to you about, bonus depreciation has come back. Obviously, I'm hearing it for, obviously different assets, but does that also apply to renewables or does that not apply to
Yeah, it can apply to renewables. So I think that there is an opportunity to take bonus. And for some ownership structures, that can be accretive, right? So thing to keep in mind is that whenever you have an asset that's owned in the context of something like a tax equity partnership or a pref
Yeah.
equity structure, it can be really challenging to take that bonus depreciation and have it flow gracefully through the partnership mechanics, right? And what I mean by that is if you have, let's say, a tax equity deal, let's say a 30% ITC tax equity deal, let's say $100 project, tax equity comes in for like 35 bucks or something like that, and they're getting 99% of the depreciation of and 100% of the asset of that $100 is
Right.
depreciated on day one. You got to bottom out on basis real fast, right? And cap and 704B
Yes.
capital, and then end up in a situation. How do you deal with it? Do you have reallocations? If you have reallocations, does that introduce tax structure risk around who is actually going to be allocated the eligible basis in the case of an ITC or the PTC, the gross profit in the case of a PTC? So while in situations where maybe you own the asset, you have taxable income, otherwise you're not putting in one of these monetization structures like tax equity, yeah, bonus could be a boon, right? But if you're looking into these other structures that might provide incremental value above and beyond what may be available under the bonus regime, maybe you take a second look at whether taking bonus is appropriate. Now, I'll never say that having options is a bad thing, right? So I'm happy to see bonus and the flexibility it provides, but like all these things, it's not without its complexities.
Oh, yeah. This reminds me of the partnership flip modeling, as you were basically alluding to the 99-1 structure.
Hmm.
And there's too much tax benefits for the tax equity investor to take, especially that year one, and
Right.
you basically structure the depreciation to not
Yeah.
take
And yeah.
today's depreciation.
And even if you do something like put together a deficit restoration obligation to avoid reallocations, unless that deficit restoration obligation is supported by something like debt, project level debt, which is, not common in my experience, those additional deductions are going to be suspended anyway. So under, tax outside basis principle, 704D, you always want to be constantly rebalancing your expectations as you think about different ownership structures because each one does have its own peculiar characteristics that need to be well understood if you're going to see if a deal pencils out.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's a great point. And obviously, like, there's always challenges related to developers love like co-locating renewable energy projects. How should developers and investors evaluate co-located renewable projects?
Yeah, there are a few different issues that can pop up. So I think that so going forward, first of all, under 48 Cap E and 45 Cap Y, the what we call the tech neutral credit regime, like that was came into play on January 1. An important distinction is that you have two main classifications of asset. You have a qualified facility, which is like an electricity producing thing, right?
Yeah.
And then you have energy storage technology, right? When you're looking at co-located facilities, how they're hooked up, those two things are going to be considered separate things and have their own thresholds for meeting, things like, let's say, domestic content requirements or something else, right? So really understanding that in this post January 1, 2025 world, we consider those things as two separate, say solar and a battery as two separate things. Whereas before, there was a lot of treatment where, okay, the battery was considered to be solar property by virtue of being fed, 100% by the solar assets, right? So it's all one commingled thing. And as it relates to maybe a practical example, let's say you were trying to fulfill something like the domestic content requirement, maybe there was an angle to say, okay, I couldn't get any domestic content stuff for my batteries, but I could for my solar. If I mash the math all together, it works out and I'm over my, let's say, 40% threshold for
For sure.
manufactured products. And of course, I have my steel and iron stuff sorted out, right? Maybe could make it work. Whereas, when you have this forced bifurcation, you have to think qualified facility versus energy storage technology basis. Now, there's also other things like you want to take into consideration about the ownership by one taxpayer of a functionally interdependent chain of equipment used for the production of electricity, right? So this idea that if there's a bunch of stuff on site and there's some ambiguity as about who owns what for U.S. federal tax purposes, which sometimes isn't super straightforward analysis, then, there can be some ambiguity as to, what credits are available. So I think that when you have those different types of technologies on site, doing that bifurcation and making sure you're crisp on the tax ownership implications or ramifications, as it were, you need to keep all those things in mind, juggle them.
Yeah, definitely. That's actually really helpful to understand. I never really thought about those things until you really talked about that, when we're looking at co-locating
Mhm.
sites. I appreciate you explaining that.
And also one other thing to consider, as we start to see maybe more things like energy storage technologies under 48 cap
For
E that are
sure.
co-located with brown power assets, right? With things that burn fossil fuels,
That's
right?
true.
Then there's also more attention, a lot more attention, I think, needs to be put into considering what might be considered dual use property, as they call it in the tax code, which is like,
Yeah.
okay, I have shared infrastructure, let's say, things like transformers or something that are going to have brown power and like energy storage technology power flowing through them. And how do I bifurcate? How do I draw the envelope around what is my energy storage asset versus what is my otherwise, a hydrocarbon asset? And that's a crucial part of figuring out what credits might be available for the storage piece.
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting too. I never thought about that because we're gonna see storage co-located with all
Yep.
different types of energy assets, and
Hmm.
obviously you wanna get the most bang for your buck.
For sure.
And then obviously, like you talked about some trends, but what trends are you seeing within the solar industry? Obviously, there's a lot of changes. I think we're all now like adapting to the new dynamic related to after the OBBB. What trends are you seeing within the solar industry?
Yeah, so not to repeat myself, but maybe the first thing that comes to mind is just this shift toward getting a more fulsome understanding of what physical work looks like just on the
Sure.
heels of that new start of construction notice. So really getting smart about that and understanding all the qualitative considerations that go into that. Now, I also think that there's more attention being put toward understanding how projects might be put together such that they could avoid the foreign entity of concern material assistance limitations. And that has a lot to do with maybe reevaluating supply chains, right? And looking at, okay, where's all this stuff coming from? Is there a way for me to pivot and try to get more stuff domestically? I think that it can be difficult to produce equipment, in the case of solar, for example, at the volume that we've traditionally seen from places like China, what stuff you make the solar, wafers out of, right? And everybody has quartz. I probably have a bunch of quartz in my yard. But the trick is, how can you apply the processes, the intense heat that's required to transform that into something that's going to be, part of a photovoltaic module, right? And interestingly, it comes down to it's more expensive to do it here because our energy prices, right, are higher and escalating. And, it's hard to compete with places where, maybe those energy prices don't have necessarily the same trajectory that ours have, right? So looking at those supply chains in more detail and understanding, okay, what options are available? Do I switch from, crystalline polysilica cadmium telluride type of thin film? And if I do that, is the supply really there, right? How many factories are there operating now and in the near future that could, help me fill my module needs, using those alternate technologies, right? To me, I think about supply chain quite a bit in that sense. Seen some promising developments, so we have some joint ventures between, glass makers and wafer makers, right? To, have job creation and produce these modules, domestically to try to, and I think for the developers that are able to participate in that portion of the supply chain, that might be a path toward understanding how to avoid those FIAC limitations as they relate to material assistance. But then even apart from that, you might want to, do the math, given the current domestic content guidance we have and how that can be used, for now as a proxy to foreign entity of concern material assistance limitations, looking at all the combinations, your current sources and saying, okay, if I have a 45% threshold I need to meet to not be subject to FIAC, how can I cobble together these pieces? Can I maybe switch out where my inverters come from or my trackers, right? And can I get over the threshold that way? And that threshold that works for 26, is that going to work for 2027? Or do I need to rethink that? I'm seeing a bit of science applied around that too, and I'm helping quite a bit with those types of computations and kind of tactical planning.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
This part's a lot more speculation, but I do think that we might see, maybe a pivot as it relates to solar to more behind the meter stuff on the balance than we've seen historically. So like historically in the US, like a 70-30 split, right? Of utility scale, front of the meter stuff versus, behind the meter stuff. And I think that the 1.5 megawatt AC threshold in the new start construction guidance might be one of those things that kind of accelerate that activity behind the meter for those smaller, lower output projects and puts them in a, maybe that 30% inches up to a higher share of the overall kilowatt hours that are produced from behind the meter solar. It really remains to be seen. I'm anxious and excited to see the innovations that are going to come out of these challenging times, whether they be technology driven or driven by structuring or whatever else. I'm excited to see what comes out and I'm excited to be part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. There's going to be a lot of innovation in a lot of parts of the industry. Have you seen any customers or any clients talking about like, I don't want the ITC, like the FIAC panel versus the non-FIAC panel
Yeah,
is like double the price. So
sure.
maybe in certain situations, it actually makes sense not to have it.
Well, yeah. So I think that in a lot of cases, yeah, like that's another thing that I've been seeing too, kind of a more thoughtful approach to thinking about when can these projects pencil out, without incentives, right? That's going to vary widely based on geography and electricity prices otherwise, and insulation, resource quality, right? And that's going to drive a lot of those decisions. What I'm seeing is much more attention being paid to things like that. And again, here's a speculation, but I think that I wouldn't be surprised if there was a state and local kind of push to help incentivize in some way these projects more than they have been for those, states and municipalities that are friendly toward this type of technology to try to offset some of the reductions that we've seen in the federal incentives. But again, that's a speculation, but I'd be happy.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, people are saying that states, like, for example, North Carolina has a strong solar state tax credit
Hmm.
and people are expecting maybe other states will pass some legislation, but obviously that's to be seen.
Yeah. Remains to be
Still
seen.
so early.
I do think that, I mean, solar has grown in particular so much since these incentives were first introduced. And in some cases, it may be the case that it does pencil out without. And also, it really comes down to we need energy, right? And where's it coming from? GDP is so tightly correlated with energy usage, right? So, even if you look at it from that kind of abstract perspective, it's understood that we need to be producing more power more and more constantly, right? So, and then one of the nice things about renewables is the relatively quick construction timeline, right? You can get those megawatts onto the grid and serve those energy needs in a really rapid way. And I'm not optimistic that other types of traditional energy assets are going to be able to get up to productive capability in time to serve those constantly, increasing energy needs that are happening right now.
Oh, yeah. And we're already seeing electricity prices going up
Sure.
substantially in certain
Sure.
markets already because there's not enough generation, really.
Yep, absolutely. And also that's driven by things like competition for LNG exports, right? So
For
much of
sure.
electricity comes from that, and we have an appetite to sell that, to export that, right? That jacks up the price of that. Lots of factors conspiring to create those high energy prices, right?
Oh, for sure. And the other thing too is solar is a technology, not a fuel. So
Hmm.
it follows Swanson's law. So the price of the panels continue to go down and the capacity continues to increase. And
Hmm.
so it's going to get lower and lower
Yeah.
a fuel. Just like two more questions really is like, can you talk about like the growth of Leo Berwick? I mean, it's been amazing. It's been only a short period of time. You've been a catalyst for the growth of the company. If people aren't familiar, like if you could talk about that and it's
Really great operation we have here. Couldn't be happier to be here with this carefully curated group of professionals. Everybody that I work with here is just the A team, top notch, passionate about the sector and what we do. And we really get a thrill, I think, from doing this work. And I think that shows. And, our passion for getting these deals done and doing the work right in the right way and being commercial, seeing the big picture, I think is really resonating with the market. And, I'm seeing more and more just kind of appetite to bring us in to operate in the agile and effective and commercial way that we do and that we'll continue to do. And, we're constantly expanding our capabilities around organic growth as well as inorganic growth and thinking about how can we best position ourselves in terms of resources and assets to serve this sector that we love in the most fulsome way possible. And, it's proved out the past 4.5 years of our relatively short existence. And I have no doubts that it will continue in that direction.
yeah, definitely. It's amazing the amount of growth, and I'm sure it's going to continue in the future. Dorian, this has been an amazing interview. I really appreciate your time today and obviously keeping our listeners up to date with all the changes that have been happening very dramatically. And you did a great job of explaining it. If our audience wanted to learn more or about Leo Berwick, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me. You can find me any number of places. Probably the easiest place is LinkedIn. You can find me there and get the communication started that way. Yeah, this has been a pleasure on my side too, Benoy. I'm really honored to have this conversation with you and be able to speak to your audience. And I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to have you come back on more in upcoming interviews. I think, obviously everything's changing and you're on the pulse of what's happening and it's extremely complicated too. I
Yeah.
mean, if you listen to this interview and you're like, wow, like there's a lot that's really going on. And obviously the incentives are so important to make to grow the industry. And obviously you need real experts. And that's what Dorian and his team are doing an amazing job. And we'll obviously have like your LinkedIn on the notes of the podcast as well as the website for Leo Berwick. And then as well, like I forgot to mention that they should check out your newsletter
Oh, right.
as well. I've been learning a lot reading the newsletter, so I appreciate you creating that as well. And you can sign up for the newsletter on your LinkedIn site.
Yeah, yep. It's Energy Transition Insider is what it's called. And I really take great pride and joy in writing up those articles. As you can probably tell, I live and breathe this stuff. So, it's fun to be able to put it on a page and get my perspective and viewpoints out there as broadly as possible.
Yeah, definitely. I've learned a lot from it. Continue the great work and thought leadership. And thank you for making time on the Solar Maverick podcast. I really appreciate it, Dorian.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick podcast. The Solar Maverick podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.